Thanks very much, Alex and Demeric, for the invitation to speak to everyone here this evening. I'll tell you a little bit about the history of the arrival of Volvo in Nova Scotia before Neville takes over and tells in a bit more detail about the operation of the plant. But as we look over to the first slide, we do have in our collection a Volvo B16 Canadian, and this is the first Volvo that came off the line of the Halifax plant when it opened in 1963. This car in particular was given to the Premier Robert Stanfield, and he in turn handed it over to the provincial government, and it was used as an official car for a number of years before it was then gifted to the Nova Scotia Museum for part of our collection. And in 1993, Volvo did refurbish this car quite completely. And that was just a few years before the Museum of Industry itself opened in 1995. So this vehicle is still on display, part of our permanent exhibit. And I will encourage you perhaps to come and visit us sometime and you can see it close up. Stanfield, I will also mention, bought a Volvo for himself as a way of boosting the company and its presence in Nova Scotia, and he encouraged a number of his cabinet ministers to do the same as well. The next slide shows some of the opening events. The arrival of Volvo in 1963 generated a great deal of excitement and optimism in Nova Scotia. The factory opening was really a gala affair on June 11th, 1963, and it was attended by Prince Bertil of Sweden, who is the gentleman on the left of that trio right there. He himself tightened the last bolt on the Volvo with a gold-plated screwdriver. And in the background there also is the first assembly plant located on the Dartmouth waterfront, which was a former Acadia sugar refinery, and that had been repurposed as the first location of the Volvo plant in Nova Scotia. The next slide then also shows Gunnar Engelau, the CEO of Volvo, who was in the province for the opening. He's placing the license plate on the second Volvo off the line. And Volvo then played a really significant presence in Nova Scotia industry over the next 35 years. Its production would peak in 1977 at about just over 13,000 vehicles for that year. And production generally ranged between 5,000 and 10,000 cars a year through the 1970s and 80s, right up until the plant closed in 1998. So, as I say, there's a great deal of optimism and a great deal of hope generated by the arrival of Volvo in the early 60s. And that optimism is really set against the background of a broader economic stagnation in Nova Scotia over the preceding decades. And that was due really to a decline in the traditional Nova Scotia industries that had sustained the province, especially shipbuilding and coal mining. So the photo that you see here from the provincial archives is the launch of the Blue Nose, the iconic Nova Scotian shipping schooner. You've seen it on the dime, of course, launched on March 26, 1921. And the Blue Nose itself was built as a racing schooner to compete in the International Fisherman's Race, and it was also a working fishing schooner, as all vessels that competed in that race had to be. Designed by William Rouet and built by the Smith and Rewland shipyard in Lunenburg and captained by Angus Walters. It was so successful over its run of competitions over the next 15 years or so that it was known as the Queen of the North Atlantic, and again became an iconic Canadian symbol throughout that time. So this kind of shipbuilding had been a mainstay in the Nova Scotia economy right throughout the 17 and 1800s. In the 19th century, Nova Scotia had the third largest merchant fleet in the world. And so all that shipbuilding, of course, also supported the lumber industry in the province. There are many iron foundries in the shipbuilding ports as well. ships that were built were not just fishing schooners, but the coastal and blue sea merchant traders that sailed all around the world as well. And you can see in the background the number of schooners that are out in Lunenburg Harbor in the background. And so that gives an indication really of just how big shipbuilding was, and the deep sea fishery was for the maintenance of the province. But already by 1921, really, wooden boats and the salt fish trade were already heading towards the decline. This was really kind of the last hurrah, in a sense, for this very old industry in Nova Scotia. And these boats in the 1930s especially were progressively replaced by faster motorized trawlers. And those faster trawlers also allowed for the sale of fresh fish rather than salt cod. And that trend only accelerated after the Second World War. So that by 1936, the Bluenose actually had a diesel engine added to it. Its topmasts were taken down. Its last race, which it won, was in 1937. And then the Bluenose was sold to a Caribbean trading company in 1942, and then wrecked on a reef near Haiti in 1946. Smith and Rowland, the shipyard that built it, then went out of business in 1967, and the shipyard ultimately closed in 2005. So this is really one of those enormous changes that were coming through in Nova Scotia, hitting its peak perhaps with the launch of the Bluenose in the early 20s, but really heading for decline through the middle part of the 20th century. And similarly with coal mining on an industrial scale had been initiated in Nova Scotia in 1928. The museum itself that I work for, the Museum of Industry, is located in the town of Stellarton in northern Nova Scotia. And there were, over our history, close to 24 different shafts that were sunk down to the coal just in our county, in Pictou County alone. What you see here is a picture of what was called the Allen Shaft, which opened in 1904. It was known as the $1 Million Mine. It was one of the deepest and most advanced in the world when it opened at that time. And it produced coal over the next 47 years before it ultimately closed in 1951. And of course, there were larger and other coal fields, not only in Pictou County, but in Spring Hill near the New Brunswick border, in Inverness and the Sydney area in Cape Breton as well. So multiple coal mines right across the north of the province, all producing coal throughout the 1800s and well into the 20th century. But again, after the Second World War especially, coal was progressively being replaced by oil as the primary fuel, both for heating and for powering industry. And coal then was on the way out here. The coal mines closed one by one across Pictou County and really right across the entire province. And the Allen Shaft then, as I already said, closed in 1951 after a serious fire, which made reopening the coal, the mine, really unfeasible. So this surface plant that you see here was demolished, like I say, in the late 1950s. And if you notice the smokestack on the left-hand side, that's the smokestack for the powerhouse where the boiler was located to produce steam for the engines on that surface plant. And looking at the next photo then, this is the picture of that smokestack being demolished in 1962. So very symbolic of the end of that era of king coal in Nova Scotia. The surface buildings already had been taken down years before. The smokestack was the last part of that plant to be destroyed. And it's still remembered really by people who are old enough. People in the county still remember going to see that event, to see the destruction of that smokestack. And so then the end of all these industries in Nova Scotia that had sustained us for so long really accelerated a process of economic stagnation, a process of younger people leaving the province, to go to Ontario, to Alberta, quite often to the United States as well, seeking work and opportunities outside of the province. And so this really all sets the stage for the arrival of Volvo. And before that also, the election in 1956 of the Stanfield government. If we go on to the next photo there, we see Robert Stanfield, born in Nova Scotia. His family owned the Stanfield woolen mills, still in operation today, as a matter of fact, in the town of Truro. And he himself studied law at Harvard in the 1930s. He had been exposed there to the economic principles of John Maynard Keynes. And during the Second World War, he had quite severe scoliosis, so he wasn't able to join the military. But he did work for the federal government in the Wartime Prices and Trade Board, which regulated the wartime economy and military production in Canada. So as a result of those experiences, really, he was a classic red Tory, quite accustomed to the idea of the government intervening in the national or in the provincial economy in order to bring about needed change. After the war, he became interested in politics. He was elected to the provincial legislature for the first time in 1949, and then became conservative leader in the mid-1950s. So he campaigned then on a platform of developing a new Nova Scotia, that his government would work very hard to attract new industries into the province to replace those older industries that were disappearing or certainly fading very fast. And after he was elected then, one of the first pieces of legislation that was passed in 1957 was a bill that created a crown corporation called Industrial Estates Limited. And that corporation was really intended, that was the vehicle that would attract new industries into Nova Scotia by developing industrial real estate. The first president of IEL was Frank Sobey, and you'll see his picture coming up next. He, as I say, was the first president of IEL from 1957 through to his resignation in 1969. He was a Stellarton man, born and bred, had founded the Sobey's grocery chain in the town in the 1920s. And he had also served as the mayor of Stellarton for over 20 years, through the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s, and lived in the town really in a very ordinary, unassuming house right up into the middle part of the 1960s. So he himself was very familiar with the rise and fall of coal mining. He could see the effect of unemployment and the contraction of industry in the town where he was born. And he, when he became president, began to pattern IEL based really on the English industrial states that had been begun in England at around the same time. In the mid-50s, there had been a gentleman, a General Casey Appleyard, who had been the chairman of an industrial state in England. He had been visiting Canada and spoke to Stanfield and his government about the idea of developing industrial estates, developing real estate, industrial real estate that would attract new industry into a certain area. And so that really was the pattern that was followed. So the idea behind IEL really was that it would develop that real estate, set up the infrastructure, build factories to the specifications of industries that were coming in, and work in that way to help to encourage the relocation of industries into the province. And that really is what brought Volvo here. Volvo itself in, I think it was 1958, had founded the Canadian branch of the company, had sold autos in British Columbia, had sold Volvos in BC, and so was looking to enter into the North American auto market. Neville will speak in more detail about that when he comes on board next. And so in 1963, Volvo began producing cars here with the help of Frank Sobey and Industrial Estates Limited. The next picture, if we can go on to that now, shows some of those Volvo bodies arriving at the port in Dartmouth. The bodies crated up, as you can see. The idea was for partially knocked down vehicles to be produced in Volvo, by Volvo in Sweden. All the parts arrive by ship in Halifax, and then those bodies were assembled into the finished products at the port right here. While we're looking at this photo, I will mention that I have to share a story with you that I've discovered, I think, may or may not be true, but it's too good a story not to share. I've had some discussion with Neville about this earlier in the week. But it may be the case that some of these Volvo bodies are still in Halifax at the bottom of Bedford Basin. There's a very old story here that some of these bodies on a particular shipment were damaged by seawater en route, and that Volvo had arranged to dump the bodies at the bottom of the harbor in the Bedford Basin, the innermost part of the harbor. Those bodies can still be seen on sonar down at the bottom. They've survived all this time. However, Neville has dug a little bit more deeply into the story than I've been able to, and it seems that there's really not very much actual evidence that they are conclusively Volvos. They are, however, some kind of car down there, and that leaves us with a bit of an automotive mystery, I think. There's something at the bottom of the harbor. We don't quite know what they are conclusively. So if any of you are scuba divers, you might want to come out to Halifax and solve that mystery for us. Next slide in the deck, though, again, is just a quick shot of a finished Volvo being loaded onto a ship bound for market in the United States. And the final slide I'll show you then is the one of the most recent additions to our collection at the Museum of Industry, which is this 1999 Volvo S7, the last automobile off the production line when the factory closed in 1998. This car was donated to the Isaac Walton Killam Children's Hospital and was offered as a raffle prize during a fundraiser. Tickets sold at $100 a piece, and it was won by Jean Romke of Dartmouth. And she drove it right up until 2017, when she donated it to the museum as part of our collection. We don't have this on public exhibit right now, but it does really kind of round off for us that that Volvo story with both the first and the last vehicles here in our museum collection. So that I'll just wind up there with that kind of brings my part of the presentation to a conclusion, and I'll hand things over now to Neville, who will take things on from there.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and thank you guys for inviting me. I'll provide more of a comprehensive overview of the kind of day-to-day operations of the plant, and what they built and how they kind of got here. Next slide, please. So to understand why Volvo came, you really have to understand there were three core themes that were kind of happening in Canada at the time, to get some more context. So right after the Second World War, Canada had been a powerhouse during the war, and the Canadian automotive industry kind of retrenched a little bit. It was suffering right from about 1945 right on up until the Auto Pact. It had suffered heavy losses. The Detroit Three basically dominated the market, and Canada's plants, the conventional wisdom at the time was automotive design would change every single year. That was extremely costly, and rather than hire more people or retain more jobs, the automakers at the time retooled their plants. So we lost several thousand jobs each year, and we never really got them back. The second theme was, as Andrew mentioned, Robert Stanfield's vision for a new Nova Scotia. He was elected in October of '56. And again, largely campaigned to diversify Nova Scotia's economy from traditional shipbuilding, the fisheries, lumber, and such, And as Andrew mentioned, IEL was the vehicle by which they would do that. Created in 57, they had $23 million worth of startup funding and a mandate to kind of attract new business and get new automakers or other industry back to Nova Scotia. And the third thing was something not even related to Nova Scotia at all, but it was actually the cancellation of the Avro Arrow. The Diefenbaker government had been in power at the time, and in 59, February of 59, they canceled the Arrow, which threw 14,500 people out of work in Ontario basically overnight. And within 3 years, Avro was gone, and another 50,000 jobs were lost. That decision kind of tainted the government for the rest of their term. And they realized that, an election was looming in April of 63. They realized that they had lost Ontario. They realized that they had lost Quebec. So they needed an economic win, and desperately. The Maritimes would be that win. And they were looking for any support that they could find in the Maritimes. Next slide, please. So Canada's auto sector was struggling, and a lot of advisors had said, well, you should build smaller cars like they do in Europe. But the Detroit Three refused to do that. So between 55 and about 1960, we'd lost about 20,000 jobs, and there was no kind of relief in sight. The Diefenbaker government, was scared. So they struck that there would be more job losses. So they actually struck the Bladen Commission in 1960 to study what could be done or what could be done to stimulate the economy. The Bladen Commission made 15 recommendations, but only 2 were followed. And it was around this time that Volkswagen actually started dominating. A foreign-built vehicle, the reliability of the vehicle kind of overshone a lot of what the Detroit Three was producing at the time. And by 1960, they actually dominated with over a quarter of the market, which at the time was unheard of. Next slide, please. So the big thing in Canada at the time was the tariff structure. So every foreign-made vehicle was slapped with a 17.5% import tariff. So regardless of what you bought, you would get hit with that tariff. And it shifted the affordability for average Canadians. So almost exclusively, they were buying Fords, Chevys, Mercurys or such. Ironically enough, Britain enjoying MFN status, which stands for Most Favored Nation, their vehicles came in duty-free, but they were so unreliable that Canadians didn't want them. They were, poor build quality. They rusted extremely easily. They were terribly unreliable in winter. And a lot of companies at the time in Canada tried looking for new ways to, I guess, bring cars over cheaper. And one of theirs was Studebaker, which had a plant in Hamilton, actually struck a deal with Volkswagen. So they would import their cars, charge them $150 per car, but for tax reasons, the government couldn't track it. There was no official agreement signed. They just kind of exchanged the cash and hoped for the best. Next slide, please. So that brings us to Volvo. Volkswagen's success in North America didn't really go unnoticed. Volvo at the time had largely only been a player in Sweden and some Scandinavian countries, and they kind of recognized early on that if they were to have any sort of long-term future, they needed the North American market, and a plant could be critical. In 1955, the first Volvos were sold in California at Auto Imports and Houston, Texas, with Swedish Motor Incorporated, and they sold the Volvo 444. A year later, in 1956, they opened in Englewood, New Jersey, and basically created Volvo Distributing there, which would later become Volvo of North America. In June of 58, the first Volvos, Volvo struck a deal with the Government of Canada and an importer in Vancouver, and basically created Auto Imports. And in 1959, on July 21st of 1959, Volvo Canada was limited and registered with the province of Ontario and the Government of Canada as the official distributor. Next slide, please. What Volvo realized, in the early 60s, despite having a really good product and a growing dealer network, sales were plateauing, and they realized that the crushing import tariffs were, critical to that. So in 61, Volvo's newly appointed president, D.W. Samuel, also known as Pat Samuel, looked to turn the tide. And he started lobbying Sweden, mainly Volvo's president Gunnar Engellau, that a plant in Canada would be critical, to boost the fortunes of the brand. In October of '61, Pat Samuel actually went to Ottawa and met with Diefenbaker's finance minister, Clyde Nolan, who himself was a Nova Scotian and largely sympathetic to the Volvo cause, and realized that diversification in Nova Scotia would be critical. And again, after the Avro Arrow fiasco, they realized that securing support in the Maritimes would be critical to their re-election plan. And to the left is actually a picture of Pat Samuel. Next slide, please. So the deal. So on February 23rd, 1963, they officially announced a deal between Volvo Canada and the federal government. Volvo had expressed an interest in building a plant, but the problem is because they weren't already here, they couldn't take advantage of a lot of the existing programs that the government had just kind of launched as a result of the Bladen Commission. One of them was a duty remission order, or DRO program, which allowed companies to import engines or foreign-made engines and transmissions duty-free. So Clyde Nolan, or George Nolan, was sympathetic to Volvo and actually gave them a special dispensation or a special DRO for painted bodies, engines, and parts, similar to the engine and transmission rebate program, which allowed Volvo to import parts from Sweden duty-free, provided they also bought Canadian-made parts, and their content would slowly be increased. As part of the deal, they had to hire 500 mechanics and at least about 400 employees at the plant that they were considering for their cars to be considered duty-free. Next slide, please. So on the left, there's actually the industrial estates ad. That was the first ad that industrial estates actually put out after they had attracted Volvo. So as I had mentioned earlier, Volvo had largely been a player only in Sweden and some Scandinavian countries, and the plant would have a huge impact on Volvo's fortunes moving forward. So in September and October of 1962, with a duty remission order program in place, Volvo met with Nova Scotia's Minister of Trade and Industry, who at the time was Ed Mason, IEL's President Frank Sobey, as Andrew mentioned, and IEL's General Manager Robert Manouge in Toronto, and Montreal to commence operations for a new plant. And in January of '63, they actually came up with a 3-year lease in which they would acquire, or lease rather, the long abandoned Acadia Sugar Refinery in Dartmouth. And they got the 500 square foot wharf and a 55,000 square foot warehouse facility for production, so they could unload the bodies and build the cars in the wharf. And between March to May of '63, they actually trained employees over a 3-month program on how to build a new 122 Canadian, as Volvo renamed them in Canada. The 122 series was called a Canadian, to take advantage of sort of the nationalistic sentiment that the cars would bring over. Next slide, please. So that's just to give you a little bit of context. You can see the wharf and ship unloading Volvo bodies. The white building closest to was the production facility, and it's a little bit out of frame, but you can see where some of the parts and stuff were unloaded also. And on the right-hand side is actually a shot from the assembly line. So those are 122 Canadians being assembled at the plant in '63. Next slide, please. So when Volvo opened on June 11th, 1963, the Dartmouth plant was actually the first foreign automotive assembly plant in North America. And, a couple companies had tried before, Fiat and Poughkeepsie tried between 1910 and 1918. Rolls-Royce had tried in Springfield, Massachusetts between 1921 and 1931, but both were closed by the start of the Second World War. So Volvo was basically the first foreign company to come since then. The Dartmouth plant featured, 57-meter production lines and 24 stations. So there were 2 lines, 24 stations, and the cars that the Dartmouth plant built between '63 to '67 were the 122 Canadian Coupe, sedan, and wagon, the infamous 123 GT, the 544, and they also built Volvo Penta Marine engines. And in terms of Canadian suppliers, as part of the DRO agreement, the first cars, and actually for quite a long run, had Surratt batteries made in Spring Hill, Hayes Dana axles that were built in Thorold, Ontario, radios from Toronto, windshields, and tires from the Goodyear plant in Toronto. And you can see on the left-hand side, that's a shot of one of the employees in Nova Scotia at the Surrett battery plant, actually building Volvo batteries. And on the bottom was the first ad promoting Canadian production of Volvos in Canada. And by 1965, the next chat in the series will cover this in more detail. But the Canada-US Automotive Pact, or Automotive Parts Agreement, actually allowed Volvo to participate and export their cars. It was a huge win for Volvo. It was the only, at the time, the only maker foreign automaker in Canada that was granted acceptance into the pact. Next slide, please. So that leads us to the Pure 9 plant. That was a 63,000 square foot plant, and you can see on the left, they actually moved over in 67. So they were on the Dartmouth side, they moved to the other side of the harbor, and you can see a shot of the Angus MacDonald Bridge in the background. And actually, you can see, if you look a little bit closer, you can see the body crates to the left of the building. And to the right is actually a shot of the 140s being assembled at the Pure 9 plant in 1971. Next slide, please. Pure 9, new beginnings in Halifax. With the lease expiring on the original Acadia sugar refinery, the company had expressed a need to demolish that plant, and Volvo basically needed a new home. Now, some feared that Volvo would leave, but in June of '66, they actually signed a 10-year agreement with IEL and the National Harbors Board, which kind of oversaw a lot of the harbor space, and the city of Halifax to build a new 63,000 square foot plant, valued at that time at about $1 million. In 2023 dollars, that'd be about $9 million or so, on a former fertilizer plant. And on April 14th, opened again by Robert Stanfield, the first 122s, and the new Volvo 140s were made at the Pure 9 facility. A lot of this was enabled because of a deal with ACL. So ACL was a ferry company, or shipping company, and they actually introduced roll-on, roll-off service, which would have a huge impact moving forward, not only for Volvo, but a lot of the European manufacturers in Canada, exporting cars to Canada. So from Gothenburg, parts kits and bodies would be dropped off at Pier 36, and then trucked to the facility on forklift carriers. There was a weekly flow of about 236 bodies or so each week. And it was one of the reasons why Volvo expanded so quickly. And by this point, Volvo was actually exporting 2,000 cars built in Canada to the US under the Auto Pact. And you can see on the left, the top picture is actually one of the ACL shipping ships dropping off Volvo engines and their rims on that shipment. And on the bottom is basically how they would load them up and truck them over to the facility. Next slide, please. So Pure 9, building a legacy. There had been a lot of misconceptions about the plant, and we're going to aim to correct a lot of them today. By 1974, the plant was actually building over 14,000 units of the new 240s. Despite its size, Halifax was actually punching well above its weight within Volvo's network. In 1980, they actually built a special edition model called the GLT. It was equipped with a high compression motor, about 141 horsepower, and at the time, it was Volvo's most powerful motor at the time. Few knew at the time, though, but this would have very significant implications moving forward. Unknown to the employees and unknown to many within the Volvo network, and largely done in secret, cars off the Halifax line were actually being shipped to Kapuskasing, Ontario, where they were tested for cold weather reliability. And few knew it was a top secret project, but a lot of that data was actually being fed back because Volvo is launching a new model called a 700 series, and they would use those same engines. So basically, cars from the Halifax line were being taken off and tested to report back on production and reliability. At the time, Halifax was the highest quality and most productive plant in Volvo's network for 5 consecutive years. It took guys in Halifax only 25 hours to build a car from start to finish, while more covered plants, if you will, Volvo's more storied plant in Kalmar and Torslanda, took on average 33 to 36 hours. With 9 test stalls and 11 quality audit inspectors, Halifax actually pioneered many of Volvo's quality practices that were used around the globe. And by 1983, they were exporting nearly a third of their production to the US. And that was about 2,500 units and about 25,000 since 63. And on the left, you can actually see some of the cars, the 240s that were built there, rolling off the line in about 1983 or so. Next slide, please. And actually, Volvo Halifax was used as a Canadian ambassador around the globe. So these are a collection of ads that were used by the province of Nova Scotia. Some were also used by the government of Canada, and it was largely championed as a huge Canadian foreign direct investment win. In fact, Volvo's example in Nova Scotia was used by the province to attract Michelin. So Michelin built 2 tire plants in Nova Scotia, which are still around, in 67, and they used Volvo's example to attract Michelin. Next slide, please. Brings us to the Bayers Lake plant, which operated from November of 87 to December of 1998. The new plant was a 135,000 square foot facility, and they built a series of models on the left, or sorry, on the right. You can actually see a Volvo 850 being built at the plant. Next. The age of modernity, Bayers Lake. With Volvo planning to phase up, so time had come on the Pier 9 plants. The 240 was getting a little bit long in the tooth, and Volvo was looking to phase out that model. Many people at the time feared that Volvo would leave Nova Scotia because the new models would they were far more complex, they had more parts, and the older plant couldn't build them. So many feared that Volvo would pack up and leave. But actually, despite its size, Volvo was proportionately one of the most economically profitable plants in Canada. In 1987, for every dollar they invested, Volvo actually generated a return of 95 cents for every dollar. By comparison, GM was only earning 51, Chrysler 33, Honda 37, and Ford about 30. So it was no surprise that on July 5th, 1986, Nova Scotia's Minister of Provincial Development, Ron Thornhill, actually announced that Volvo would build a brand new 135,000 square foot plant on a 16-acre site for about $13 million. Adjusted, that was about 31.6 in 2023 dollars. And it was invested solely by Volvo. The state-of-the-art plant would build a new 740 series, and production would start in November of 1987. Kind of different to the first 2 plants, which were very kind of manual labor focused. The new plant actually had 3 lines, 22 workstations, and actually blended of both as manual and robotic automated lift carriers, and they also had robots for the windshield sealer and stuff. And not surprising, Volvo was able to complete a finished, the Halifax plant rather, was able to complete a finished Volvo 740 in only 33 hours within a 10-minute cycle time. So each station had only 10 minutes to do that. Volvo's next best facility in the world, Kalmar, could only manage 37. So Volvo, the Halifax plant beat some of Volvo's, more storied or best plants in the network. Next slide, please. And that you can see on the left are 2 of the 740s that were built at the plant. And Canadian 740 production lasted from about November of 1987 to August of 1990 before they switched to the 940. And to mark their 30th anniversary in Canada, in June of 1993, they actually released a special edition model. There were only 150 made, but they built a special 940 turbo to mark the anniversary, if you will. And many are actually still on the road. Next slide, please. Building for the new millennium. Bayers Lake, by the 1980s, Volvo's 2 models that they had previously built in Canada were getting a little bit old, and Volvo desperately needed a car that would take them into the 1990s. So it was, at the time, it was the largest industrial project in Sweden's history, but the Volvo 850 was an unprecedented new platform. It was front-wheel drive. It was revolutionary, used new bonding techniques and manufacturing practices that had never been, attempted by Volvo before. It was problematic because the Halifax operation had only been tooled for more traditional rear-wheel drive cars. And again, many feared that the investment required would cause Volvo to pack up and leave, but they didn't. Between July and August of 1995, Volvo actually spent $8 million. Now, adjusted, that was 45% of the initial cost of the plant, which was astronomical. to build the 850 series. The first 850 rolled off the line on August 30th, 1995, in just 3 weeks. Just 3 weeks, they tooled over an entire plant to build an entire new model, completely different from the previous one, that required huge changes in robotics, tilt carriers and such. And they did it in just 3 weeks after the last Volvo 940 rolled off the line. In fact, Halifax pioneered at the time a revolutionary concept for vehicle assembly in North America, direct to consumer assembly. So essentially, for every 850 that rolled off the line, it was custom built and it was pre-sold. Not a lot of plants at the time were doing that. In fact, Volvo was the first plant to do that on a 100% basis. Some plants had attempted it in like 30%, 40%, but the Halifax operation was the first plant to fully convert to that model, which is now conventional wisdom now. And by December of 1995, Halifax had actually tied Toyota's Cambridge, Ontario plant for the best quality ranking in JD Power and JD Power and Associates initial quality plant rankings. So basically, they were tied for the best plant in North America. As small as it was, they had one of the highest ratings of any plant in North America. Next slide, please. In 1997, the plant was again tooled for the 850 success for the new Volvo S70 and V70 series. But, employees at the time had heard that, there could be something changing, that, Volvo could be launching a new model. But it came as a huge shock on September 9th, 1998, when Volvo actually announced the plant was closing in Bayers Lake. Now, why would a car maker close their highest quality plant, the plant with the highest productivity, and a plant they just spent, nearly 45% of the initial building cost to retool to be a new model? Volvo Halifax had consistently proven within the Volvo network that not only could they build cars faster, but they could meet challenges that, a lot of the other facilities couldn't. Volvo at the time had claimed overcapacity and the inability to build all-wheel drive cars, or the new Volvo P2 series, which was coming in 1999, which would have launched with the Volvo 850. But they closed the facility, and the plant was officially closed on December 18th, 1998, but the last car actually rolled off the line on December 11th. Ironically enough, on January 29th, 1999, Volvo was sold to Ford Motor Company, and a lot of people started putting two and two together and said, well, maybe, there could be more to this. The evidence is kind of scant because a lot of that was bound by NDAs and such, but to understand some of the rationale, you kind of have to look at, what was happening in the broader automotive sector at the time. Ford was in the midst of a Firestone and Explorer scandal with the all-terrain tires that were blowing out in hot climates. Ford already had auto pack status, so they could have imported Volvos basically duty-free. And one of the elements, and I think this played it in a little bit bigger, was Volvo was unionized under the Canadian Auto Workers Union, or the CAW, as were Ford's Canadian facilities. There could have been, had Halifax lasted and Ford shut them down later, there could have been threats from the CAW for wildcat strikes at other facilities. So, it just generally made more sense to deal with that before the takeover. So that's, it's a little bit of speculation. That's what I think happened, but yeah. And on the left is actually a picture of the last Volvo built in Canada. So it rolled off the line at about 2:30 on December 11th, 1998, and it was a 1999 Volvo S70 GLT. Next slide, please. And just a special thanks. I've been working on this project for a while, but I just wanted to say thanks to everyone so far that's kind of supported this project, especially the employees who have been really amazing. And that was one of the last group photos taken at the plant in about 1994 or so. 1995, when the first 850 rolled off the line. So you can see the 850, the first car built in Halifax, the 250,000 Volvo, and the special edition 940. Thanks. Hope you enjoyed that.
Well, thank you so much, Neville and Andrew. We'll open it up to Q&A now. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A tool at either the top or bottom of your screen to post them, and we will commence to asking. I guess I'll start us off with a question about the Volvo Canadian specifically. Was there anything other than, I guess, badge engineering or rebranding that marked it as a uniquely Canadian vehicle?
You want me to take this?
Certainly, yes.
Okay. Well, there were a couple market variations between the two. They had built Volvos in Sweden for different markets, for the European market and such. The Canadian models were very similar to the American kind of export models, which came in from Sweden. The badges were different, obviously, on the front fenders and the trunk. There were a couple variations later. The early cars, not so much, but a little bit later down the line, like in the 60s, in the late 60s, around 67, 68. The Canadian cars complied with a lot more Canadian kind of federal regulations for vehicle safety. So they had like four-way flashers, stuff like that. They also built a model, and it actually got both badges. It was called the 123 GT. That production started in January of 1967. And there were significant variations between those models. So those cars would have had four-way flashers, limited slip differential. Those are the main ones, and a couple small things here or there, like they got dash tacks and stuff like that. So there were some variations, but for the most part, they were pretty similar to what the cars were in the States.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
And actually, one thing to add to that, and a lot of people, I didn't have time to cover it, but as part of the DRO agreements for those cars, Volvo wasn't actually obliged to put Canadian parts on the cars. They just had to buy them. So what ended up happening was Volvo was actually buying Canadian parts. They were putting them on the cars in Halifax, but they were actually shipping Canadian parts to Sweden. So, for example, those Dana Hayes axles I mentioned, all the 122s, 140s, 240s, 940s, 740s, all got axles made in Ontario on them. So if you bought, Volvo in South Africa, your car would have axles made in Ontario on it.
Gotcha. A question from a Zoom seminar regular, Clark. Hi, Clark. For you, Neville. Can you speak a bit more to, or do you know anything about Volvo's involvement in the rally scene in Nova Scotia, and I guess racing more generally locally, and whether their successes apparently in rallies had much of an impact on their success as a brand?
Yeah, well, yes and no. So up until about 1960, don't quote me on the exact year, but I think about 1965, Volvo actually sponsored heavy-duty rally teams. So Volvo's operations in Canada actually had dealer-sponsored and factory-sponsored teams. There was a crash, I believe in 1965. I think it was the Acropolis Rally, but don't quote me on that, where two mechanics, Volvo mechanics, were killed. It was a car crash. Two of them were killed. And Volvo kind of stepped back immediately from kind of rally racing officially. But they had a division called Competition Service in our sport, which actually sold parts to, you could go into your dealer and pick them up, but they also sold them to dedicated rally teams. So, Volvo indirectly sponsored rally racing well into like the mid 1970s. But they did participate in rallies like the Shell 4000. They did do stuff kind of internationally. There were a couple Ontario-based rallies or Canadian-based rallies. They did some Targa racing, but yeah, for the most part, they a lot of their brands, with even some of their ads, actually promoted rally racing in the early '60s for the 122 series, especially.
John would like to know whether, especially the first Volvos made, whether they could stand Canadian road salt conditions.
Yes. So yes, in fact, one of the guys who actually has helped with this project was the guy who used to spray the undersealer on the cars, Percy Seal. Volvo actually did two things with the Canadian cars. The undercoating was actually a lot thicker and heavier duty. So That's why a lot of them are still on the road. A lot of the Canadian cars are still on the road. But yes, they used a thicker substance on the undercarriages, and also like shipping the cars back and forth. They were coated in heavy duty wax. So on the early cars that in Andrew's presentation you saw kind of an exposed body. It looked kind of dull because they were painted in Sweden, but they were actually coated with a heavy duty wax that was so thick it actually had to go through a steam bath to get it off. So yeah, actually the undercoating was really good.
Now a question from Dimitri, actually our speaker for next month. Hi, Dimitri. That I'm going to sort of put to both of you and expand on his question. Do we know if the plant was profitable? And I guess maybe more for Andrew. Do we know, did IEL consider this an unmitigated success? Did they have any reservations about the plant sticking around?
As far as IEL goes, I mean, I think it was considered a success. IEL itself, though, was discontinued as a program in the early 70s after a change in government in Nova Scotia. But I think it was generally considered a success. It came in for criticism, I think, really because of the cost of the program, and there's been some debate, I think, as to whether the Volvo project got as much benefit to Nova Scotia as it might have done. Otherwise, I believe it was profitable as a factory, and it certainly employed lots of people over a 35-year history.
Care to speak to that, Neville? Or?
Yeah, well, sort of along the same lines. I mean, companies don't generally keep plants going that are unprofitable, right? One particular example was Hyundai. They lasted like 3 years. They built cars in Quebec and lasted like 3 years before they shut down. To have 3 plants to build almost 10 different models and variations, and to be able to export cars from Halifax down to the US, especially places like New Jersey, Boston, upper state New York, Maine. So to have export status, to have 3 plants, to have employed between 193 to about 220 people for well over 35 years, well, I would say it was a huge success to achieve the quality rankings they did, to achieve practices that were pioneered at a plant small as it was, but to be used in Volvo's global network. I would say it was a huge success, and to use that example to attract other businesses. I didn't have a chance to touch it, but Volvo being the first set the example for a lot of foreign automakers that are still here today, right? You look at Honda, Toyota, Volkswagen, and Westmoreland, and later on, you look at the joint ventures between Suzuki and General Motors at CAMI. You look at Honda and Alliston. All those facilities used Volvo as an example, and they kind of said, well, hey, wait a minute, if Volvo can build cars here, then maybe we can make a go of this. Had it not been for Volvo, it could have been the 80s, the early 80s at a minimum, before like the first, assuming that no one else had come through it. The next closest plant would have been Honda, and it also this was in Quebec, but Renault, Peugeot, with CMI, Toyota, which was also in Nova Scotia. All of those companies used Volvo as an example to say, hey, yes, we can make foreign and make profitable foreign cars in North America. So yeah, overall, I would say very successful.
Great, thank you. Andrew, John wants to know if sort of what any knockdown or follow-up industries there were after Volvo shut down in Nova Scotia. Where did that workforce go? Do we have a sense of that?
Very hard.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, hard to say where that workforce went. I mean, I think certainly I'm not aware that there was another main manufacturer in Nova Scotia that would have absorbed those workers. I mean, it's quite possible that they went on to Ontario, or it's very difficult to say. But yeah, I don't think that there was a follow-up industry after Volvo that would have absorbed those workers. They would have been dispersed, I would expect, in several different industries.
Well, also a factor was the average age of the plant by 1995, or sorry, by 1998 rather. They were close to retirement age, a good chunk of them. The ones that weren't, found jobs in other sectors. It was difficult, but they found jobs in other sectors like consulting and stuff and such, or other industries. But the average age of the plants shortly before the closure was about 50, 55. So they were fairly close to retirement by early 90s standards or mid 90s standards.
Gotcha. Combining, Alex, are you about to cut me off?
Well, I was just going to say it's 8 o'clock, but I think we have there's quite a few like really quick questions we can answer. So I will permit it this evening with all the enthusiasm.
Take more, no problem.
So
you got me already. I'll take more.
From Heike and Sandor, combining your questions together, how many Volvos in total made in Nova Scotia, and how many of those ended up exported outside of Canada?
Good question. Two parts to that question. Not to knock Volvo, but their production keeping for the from about 1963 to about 1974 was kind of spotty. I have a pretty good idea of the numbers per year, again scanning through like old newspaper articles and stuff, or kind of registers. Overall, about an estimated about 320,000 cars were built in Canada, from the 122 series, the 544, right up until the S70 and B70. Of those, they were exporting about a third of their product from the 740 onwards. So about November of 1987 to 1998, they were exporting about a third of the production. So about 2,000 cars, 3,000 cars, and most of those went to the East Coast on the U.S. So dealers in Maine, dealers in New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. And they were kind of shipped or trucked down from the plant there. So I hope that kind of answered it. So yeah, about 320,000 cars in total, and on average about 2,000 to 3,000 export cars per year.
Let me see here. I want to find one good capstone question to finish us off. Okay, I guess you know what, we kind of talked about this, I guess, in our drive on, but can you briefly tell us the story about Gary Sowerby's Volvo and the trip around the world?
Sure. Yeah. I don't have the exact number of days and hours and stuff that he took, but basically the story was Kim Langley and Gary Sowerby, they were working with for the federal government at the time. And one fine day they said, we drive a lot. Why don't we do something with it? So they decided to try and break the Guinness World Record for the fastest circumnavigation of the Earth. And they looked at a couple different models and eventually settled on a Volvo to do it. So the car was built at the Halifax plant. It was a 1980 Volvo 245 DL station wagon. And they broke the Guinness World Record, which stood up until the rules were changed. So that rule will never be broken. But they won the Guinness World Record for the fastest circumnavigation of the Earth in a Canadian-made Volvo, which is still on the road and is actually at a museum or Hall of Fame rather in New Brunswick. A couple of years ago, Volvo Canada actually celebrated, I think it was the 30th anniversary of the drive, and they actually drove the car down and kind of replicated. The trip started in Toronto, but they kind of replicated the trip, going to the restaurants of all the places that they had been on the trip. So they were able to do it in Toronto.
Great.
Great. And a final question, Demeric, and we'll wrap it up here at 8:05.
A little bit of trivia. Any info on a single Halifax-built Volvo police car that apparently ended up in testing by the city? John is saying that his father helped open the plant and was involved in the production of a singular Volvo-made police car.
So it wasn't a singular Volvo-made police car. The Halifax plant actually made quite a few Volvo police cars. Volvo had a deal in the early 80s. Volvo had been used as a police car in Sweden and some Scandinavian countries for years. But Volvo decided to try their hand at police cars for the North American market using the 240s. And the Halifax plant built those. So Maine tried them, and a couple other states tried test cars from there. They built, I think, I don't know the exact number, but I think they built a couple for Halifax police. New York had a couple, and Maine had a couple. They actually tried California Highway Patrol. In the latter part of the plant, California Highway Patrol actually did a test run of and the RCMP2 of Volvo S70 T5 police cars, which were built at the plant and then upfitted at a place in Quebec called Vecchi Tech in Longueuil, Quebec. But yeah, they did build police cars. They built quite a few police cars. And they were special models. Most of them were turbos, so they would have been built. They had earlier cars too, but the special edition cars they were mostly turbocharged. That would have been around the Halifax plant started building 240 turbos in about November of 1983 up till 1985. So yeah, they would have been after that.